Let's talk about trash, but not just any trash. We're talking about the garbage that gets packed up, put on a truck, and sent on an international journey right into the middle of a geopolitical firestorm. For millions of people in Ontario, Canada, this is exactly what happens every day. It's the wild story of how their garbage became a huge political issue in North America.
Okay, just take a look at this number for a second. Over 3.4 million. It's a massive, kind of hard to wrap your head around figure, right? Well, that's how many tons of Canadian trash got buried in Michigan landfills in a single fiscal year. To put that in perspective, we're talking about hundreds of tractor trailers crossing the border every single day, just loaded down with garbage. So the big question is, how did this even happen? How did a quiet stretch of the US-Canada border turn into what's basically a massive conveyor belt for trash? To really get it, you first have to understand the sheer scale of this whole thing. This isn't just a few trucks here and there. No, this is an industrial-level flow of waste that's become a key part of the economy on both sides of that border. Michigan's landfills take in a staggering amount of waste, over 24 million tons. But here's the really interesting part. Look at where it's all coming from. While the state generates most of its own trash, Canada is by far the biggest single source of imported waste. Let me put that another way for you. Almost 1/7 of all the trash buried under Michigan soil actually comes from Canada. The province of Ontario has become incredibly dependent on having this escape valve. And this quote from policy advisor Peter Hargrave, well, it just perfectly sums up the crisis Ontario is facing. If Michigan were to suddenly close its doors, some projections show the province could literally run out of its own landfill space as early as 2034. They are in a real bind. Okay, so why in the world would you drive millions of tons of trash across an international border? Well, the answer, as it so often is surprisingly simple. It's about the money. 36 cents? That's it. For years, this was the state tipping fee, basically a tax that Michigan charged to dump 1 ton of trash in its landfills. An unbelievably absurdly low number. And when you put Michigan's 36-cent fee right next to its neighbors, the whole picture just snaps into focus. Ohio charges almost $5, Wisconsin is at $13. Michigan essentially put out a giant welcome mat, making itself the cheapest dumping ground in the entire region, hands down. Now, as you can imagine, this huge economic incentive created a major political battle inside Michigan. For years, politicians tried and failed to end it, which brings us to Governor Gretchen Whitmer and her big plan. Governor Whitmer's plan seemed pretty simple on the surface. Let's hike that fee from a measly 36 cents all the way up to $5 a ton. The goal was to just get rid of the financial reason for all this out-of-state dumping. But the proposal immediately slammed into a wall of fierce opposition, and ultimately, it went nowhere. So why did a plan that seems like such a common-sense fix fail so spectacularly? Well, it ran into 2 huge roadblocks. One was all about politics, and the other was constitutional. First up, the politics. Business groups launched this really intense lobbying campaign, and they successfully branded the fee hike not as an environmental move, but as a trash tax. They argued it would unfairly punish Michigan's own citizens, its schools, and its hospitals by making their disposal costs skyrocket. But the second reason, and honestly, this was the real deal breaker, is the U.S. Constitution itself. There's something in it called the Commerce Clause. And courts have interpreted it to mean that states just can't discriminate against out-of-state commerce. So Michigan couldn't just raise fees on Canadian trucks, they'd have to tax their own waste at the same exact rate. And that, of course, made that trash tax argument politically toxic. So, with the state's hands completely tied, the focus of this whole story suddenly shifted, away from the state capital in Lansing and onto a much, much bigger stage, Washington, D.C., and a new era of trade protectionism. The Trump administration's aggressive trade policies just completely changed the game. When a 35% tariff was suddenly imposed on most Canadian goods in early 2026, waste transformed from just an environmental issue into a really valuable trade commodity. At first, it really looked like trash had dodged a bullet. There was this little loophole in the USMCA trade deal that classified it as a Canadian originating good, meaning it was produced in Canada, and that made it exempt from the 35% tariff. You can imagine there was a huge sigh of relief in Ontario. But, and this is where it gets incredibly complicated, a new rule that was put in place back in August 2025, one designed to stop Chinese goods from evading tariffs by passing through Canada, created this unexpected and absolutely massive threat: the transshipment penalty. And here is the danger. Municipal trash is a mix of everything, right? You've got discarded foreign-made electronics, plastics, packaging, all kinds of stuff. Under these new rules, if a border agent finds a single Chinese-made item in a truckload of Canadian trash, the entire shipment could get hit with a devastating 40% penalty. The financial risk is just enormous.
So what was once a simple economic equation, just ship your trash to the cheapest landfill, has now become this high-stakes geopolitical gamble. This quote really captures Ontario's vulnerable position perfectly. The province is now totally dependent on a trade relationship that is becoming more volatile and unpredictable every single day. The rules could literally change with a single executive order. And that leaves us all with one final, provocative question. What happens when a basic public service, like taking out the trash, gets caught right in the crossfire of a global trade war? It's a question that leaders on both sides of the border are now desperately trying to answer.